So, what were my beliefs, you might ask? Well, because of my background as an orphan, as someone who was a self-made man, you might say, I had very different beliefs than the previous presidents before me. For example, I believed that Washington was corrupt. And I'm sure if I were still around today, I would say Washington was corrupt. Politics in D.C., I think, were ruled by a few select elite who were not responsive or responsible to the common man. I think, as president, I should serve the common man. And when I say common man, I mean all you good, landowning, white people. But not women, just men. Got it? Okay. Okay, so that's enough of that. My voice is getting tired. Okay, so we've talked about number one, Old Hickory. So let's move on to number two, the elections of 1824 and 1828. I think the maps of these elections really tell the story. So let's stop here. Let's look at a map of the election of 1824, and then we'll look at the map of the election of 1828. Okay. In 1824, we saw that Jackson barely lost. Just barely. And there was even some controversy about that. So, the election of 1828 rolls around, and Andrew Jackson, this time, makes sure that he will not lose. Okay? If you look on YouTube now, you have examples of ads that Andrew Jackson and his supporters put out. This was the first time, really, in presidential history that a president, or really any elected official, had put out advertisements, just like these slips of paper saying, hey, vote for me. And if you notice, they were pretty simple messages. They weren't complicated, because again, Jackson wanted to appeal to the common man. If we look at a map of the election of 1828, you'll see he did appeal to the common man, and he won big time. So let's stop and look at that map. Okay? Now you might be asking, wow, so how many people exactly voted for Andrew Jackson? Well, if we look right here, we're going to look at a chart that shows state by state who voted for Andrew Jackson and the percentages of voters that came out. And it's pretty amazing, I think. So we know that in the election of 1828, a lot more voters came out. Huge percentage increase from 1824. And to me, that's kind of curious. Why is there this huge percentage increase in every single state? Why do so many voters come out? Is it because new voting rights? Is it because Jackson was just really awesome and everybody liked him? Well, it was a combination of a lot of different things. So, number three, we're going to talk about Jacksonian democracy. Okay? Jacksonian democracy. This is a complicated term. Basically what it refers to are the changes that were brought about by Andrew Jackson as president. The changes in our democracy, Jacksonian democracy. So let's look at the first changes that Jackson kind of brought in as president. First change was a change in politics. Jackson changed the way that politics were done. Instead of these rich, wealthy, landowning, often slave-owning men coming in, men like Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, James Monroe, James Madison. All the previous presidents, they were from really rich families, and they had a lot of money. Jackson, as we know, was different. He wasn't born with a lot of money. He was orphaned at 13, and he understood, by and large, the suffering that ordinary Americans had to go through because they weren't rich. And he knew that presidents oftentimes ignored those common men. So, of course, we see in his campaign for president in 1828, we see kind of his appeal. He kind of lowers the language of politics. Instead of talking in terms that only a few people can understand who are really well educated, he talks in common man terms. So we're going to stop here and look at modern day examples of politicians using kind of common everyday language. when they could be using really high, elevated language. Okay? Okay, so now that we've looked at some modern day examples of political campaigns by presidents, the language they use, we can talk about two, specifically Jackson's appeal. He had huge and widespread appeal as a president. For one, he fought Indians. And guess what? Back then, Americans were very racist towards Indians in general, especially if you pursued that dream of manifest destiny and you wanted to move west while the Indians were in your way. You wanted to kick them out. So a lot of Americans liked the fact that he had killed 1,000 Creek Indians at Horseshoe Bend, or that he invaded Florida to capture some Indians. Okay? So, we talked about Jackson's appeal, and now I want to talk about B, the most important thing we'll be discussing today, changes in suffrage. What is suffrage? Suffrage, simply put, is the right to vote. It's one of your key terms. Make sure you know that. Suffrage is the right to vote. And there were pretty remarkable changes in suffrage in the early 1800s, especially in the 1810s and the 1820s. Okay? So what we're going to do now is stop and look at how these changes in suffrage were brought about. Who now was allowed to vote. And this in turn will explain why so many people were able to come out and vote for Jackson. And then, excuse me, and finally C, we'll finish up with the rise of the common man in American politics. Notice, common man, not women. And man, again, doesn't mean black, it doesn't mean Native American, it means white. Often, you had to have property. Okay, so now that we've looked at the changes in the state constitutions, I want to kind of wrap this up and really hit home C right here, the rise of the common man. So even if you just look at that chart of the elections of 1824 and 1828, you can see the huge change in voter participation. And this kind of shows us, when Andrew Jackson became president, he was the president of the common man. He was serving not the wealthy bankers, not the plantation owners. He was serving common men. And this explains a lot of his decisions and a lot of his policies that we'll get into tomorrow.